You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson.
I'm your co-host, Matthew Fisher, and we're joined with a very special guest this week, Gerard Rennick. How are you, Gerard?
Yeah, good. Thanks, John and Matthew.
It's great to have you on the
Thanks for coming on.
podcast.
No,
You're
you're
obviously
welcome.
a much requested guest, so it's good that we could finally make this happen. You're a very busy man, so we'll get right into the meat and guts of things. Obviously, we've just had the federal election. Unfortunately, I'd even say tragically, you didn't win back your Senate spot. But that was always going to be a very long shot, I suppose, just because of the dynamics of Queensland and the minor party right-wing vote up there. Do you want to give us a little bit of information about what the post-game has been like for you with the federal election?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, it's been very, very busy actually, because and it's in regards to actually compliance with the party, filling out, recording, getting all the expenses and the accounting together for the party, and the campaign expenses, lodging that with the AEC. I lodged all our candidates' forms. We actually refunded our candidates their electoral expenses, unlike, say, One Nation. So all of our candidates, they had their expenses reimbursed for their registration fees. And here in Queensland, we refunded all of their campaign costs as well. So that took time. Obviously, we've got GST returns to do, BAS returns. That is a BAS return, GST returns. We've done our annual compliance return. So there's quite a lot of work to do with compliance, as well as that I had to get out of the office. And then since I've been out of the office, I've been talking to people, first mainly here in Queensland, but in other states as well, trying to get branches up and running. So that's been taking up a lot of time, as well as coming up to speed with all the software. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to post on Facebook because for some reason they won't let me change my name and take the senator out of my title. So we need to get that resolved sooner rather than later. But I'm having a few weeks off social media just for the time being, just so I can catch up on some of the other compliance that needs to be done with running a party.
Yeah, fair enough. And that's what you're mainly concerned with, I guess, going into the future is you setting up the party. Mainly the big concern, big question that everyone's been having is, are you going to be taking the route of setting up individual branches and giving those branches autonomy and ability to select candidates and councils and things like that? Or are you going to be taking the One Nation route of, or even some people would say the Reform UK route of having a real top-down structure?
No, we're starting out with the branch model at this stage. We believe that there's a real weakness out there and a real opportunity for parties who are prepared to do some grassroots campaigning. The major parties rely on mainstream media to push their message. We don't have that luxury. We do have a social media following, obviously, but we have to go back to grassroots campaigning if we're going to get our message out there. Furthermore, too, I think that it's really important that members of a party have a say, because, One Nation have been happy to, I mean, let's say from 2016 onwards, before then they were, they had Pauline represented for 3 years in 96 to 98, 99, and that was it. But you can't put Corflute candidates in the field 5 minutes, to midnight in an election, i.e., a week or two out, basically. That's enough to get 4 or 5% of the vote. But we want to be a reform-like party where we're up in those low 20%. Now, we're obviously a long way from that. I mean, that'll take at least a decade. But I believe that if we become the party of choice for the minor parties, because we do have branches, number one, we do give autonomy to our members and allow them, when I say autonomy, obviously they get voting rights in who their candidates are and who their Senate candidates are. And then they get out and, if you have branch meetings, they can organise these candidates much, much earlier. They can get out and campaign. They can do letterbox dropping, etc. That will help grow the party because we desperately need a party. And by the way, we don't call ourselves a right-wing party. We call ourselves an issues party. About 20%.
Yes, that's something I was impressed by, to be honest. But continue.
Yeah, because 20% of our membership are actually from ex-Labor, blue-collar Labor people. And we want to represent those blue-collar Labor Party because effectively we want to represent the individual. And we're capitalists. We're not free marketeers. There's no such thing as a free market. I've never been to a market that's free. There's only two outcomes in a market. You're either making money or losing money. However, we are capitalists. But, and we call people capitalists, people who risk their own capital. And of course, that includes human capital as well. And for too long, there's been a false dichotomy between financial capital and human capital. But, if you're an 18-year-old and you're starting out in the workforce, you don't have much financial capital, but, it's your attitude and your ambition and your drive and your willingness to learn. That's your capital. And that's, human capital or intellectual capital, whatever you want to call it. So they're the people we want to promote the individual and the families and hold the unrestrained authority of the institutions to account. And that includes big media, big corporations, big governments, because like all and I'm 55 this year. I've been around for a while, and these big organisations, doesn't matter whether they're public or private, it's always the same. The yes men or the toadies generally climb to the top, and they do what they're told to keep their jobs, and that means they end up invariably putting the organisation they work for in front of the actual best interests of the people. And we're seeing that at the moment, especially in politics, but also with the media. Mainstream media and corporations that just don't, serve their shareholders or similar.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the iron law of oligarchy, that those who are pursuing their own power will always overpower those who are looking out for the interests of those that they're supposed to represent.
Yeah.
I believe Matthew had a question that he wanted to jump in with.
Yeah, you mentioned how other parties struggle with attracting candidates, and you guys did a very good job in your first election to have such a large selection across many states. So how do you go forward to attract talented people in the party, both as candidates and donors, and into your branches, and how do you sustain that for long term? What are your thoughts?
Well, that's the point of having your branches, and also, making sure that we cover most of the costs of the candidates, so it's easy for them to run. I mean, many candidates, it costs you, per candidate, just as a bare minimum. You'd be pushing $10,000 by the time you pay $2,000 registration fee, get $3,000 or $4,000 worth of core flutes and another $3,000 or $4,000 worth of out of vote cards. So, that's what we did this time, and we'll continue to do that. And if you give people, if you look after your candidates, if people can see that they can go to branches, have a say, get to vote on who their candidates are, get to vote on policy, I think that they'll go. And we can see the results. Basically with One Nation. I mean, Pauline got into politics the same time Bob Brown did in 1996. And here we are, almost 30 years later, and the Greens have, well, they should have 12 senators. 2 senators have left, but there's 12 senators in the Senate that were elected under the Greens banner. Lydia Thorpe and Dorinda Cox. Lydia's gone independent, and Dorinda's gone to Labor. But the point is that they're getting senators up in every state and every election. And they had recently 4 members in the lower house, but they've got a very large representation across all parliaments in all states. And we are much more fractured on the right, and that's got to change. And I believe one of the reasons why we've been fractured on the right is that Pauline and Clive haven't been prepared to work with each other or other parties, and we saw that in the recent election. People first, we ran with the Catters up here, we ran with the Libertarians and the Hart Party in New South Wales, and we ran with the Hart Party in Victoria. We also were offered to Family First to run behind them in South Australia. They didn't take us up on that offer. But we are happy to work with other minor parties, and we'll continue to do so. Especially with the likes of the Hard Party, DLP. We want to, try and bring some of these smaller parties together, and we'll stay, keep our alliance with the Catters going as well. We want to work on both working with other parties and non-personality driven other parties, and also growing the membership, because we believe we can grow the membership. And so we've got 2,500 members now. We're aiming for 5,000 members by 2028 at $50 a throw. That's $250,000 a year. We can run the party on about 50,000 with software costs and licensing fees and things. I'm running I'll be working pro bono for the next 3 years. But if we can grow that to $1 million by 2028, that can fund our registration fees for our candidates and core flutes, shirts, and how to vote cards. And if we, and that's sort of, so effectively, plus what we can raise, but effectively, just by being part of the party, you can help fund the next campaign if you stick with it for the next 3 years. And that's our strategy, just a grassroots campaign. We don't want to rely on any one big donor. So I guess that's how we intend to sort of become the party of choice. And it's also fair to say too, I genuinely believe we have the best solutions. I mean, and we have solutions that promote the individual and the families. Our tax-free threshold of $45,000, is, it's a win-win on so many levels for pensioners, for low-income earners. You can basically don't need superannuation if you can earn the first $45,000 tax-free. You don't need to put all that money in a super to get, the benefits of it. Childcare directly paid to the parents. This is becoming more and more relevant as, we're seeing pedophiles roaming the halls of childcare centres. And then, of course, voluntary superannuation so that younger people can save for a house faster.
Yeah, exactly. That's what really stuck out from your party amongst the other offerings, was that you really were policy focused, and your policies were sort of, I'd say they were realist. And I was interested by the fact that you reject the term right wing, which I do think is kind of a step forward in political thinking in Australia. Those of us who are interested in politics, of course, we understand the ideas behind it. We're interested in the ideologies and the history behind all of it. But the average voter doesn't know that the Liberal Party is named after economic liberalism, which infers, the opening up markets and things like that. They just think of it as the brand of the centre-right party that has this, that, the other character that they're going to go vote for. They like this person's personality better. And the fact that you're coming in here and saying we're not a right-wing party, we're sort of I'd almost describe you as sort of a nationalist realist party where you're looking out for the Australian interest, using policies not described in ideological language. You're talking in terms of really numbers most of the time, which is definitely a switch up from a lot of other candidates. And I do think that that's going to help you to attract the sort of elite human capital, that for candidates, and hopefully then you'll be able to win votes from the rest of the so-called centre right or the right wing in general.
Yeah.
It's definitely contrasts a lot with, for example, ideological parties like the Libertarians or the personality parties like One Nation. That you're coming in there with the policies, with the solution, you're putting it down on the table. The only trouble for me is how are you going to be able to then communicate that to the average voter, who oftentimes is very low information, considering a lot of your ideas are fairly complex. They're going to take a fairly revolutionary approach to how we look at finances, how we look at the way that retirement is structured, and so on and so forth. Even things like, for example, climate change or immigration. Many of these things I agree with you on, mind you, but communicating that to the average voter, that's always the trick. What's your plan going forward with that?
Well, that's why our 5 key, if the three of the 5 key policies, the first three of the 5 key policies are very simple to get across. I mean, 14 million people earn a salary, 3 million people are pensioners, and another 3 million are small business. So if you lift the tax-free threshold to $45,000, that will be a tax cut for 14 million workers. It'll mean pensioners can earn another $15,000 a year, and it means small business can earn another $45,000 a year as well. And if we can actually make superannuation voluntary and ultimately redundant because we've got a high tax-free threshold, that will simplify, work for businesses as well, small business, because they can just pay the gross salary, and not have to mess around with superannuation as well. So the way we can get that message out, but it won't be easy. As I said before, we've really only got social media and grassroots campaigning, but I believe with word of mouth, we can at least try to aim for 6 or 7%, get our nose in front of One Nation, get into the Senate. And the goal is to get Senate representation first, because under proportional voting in the Senate, you only need 14% of the vote to get a senator in. And as One Nation showed us in Western Australia and New South Wales, they got in on 6% of the vote. So they actually needed to rely on a higher percentage of votes from the other minor parties and the Liberal third preference to get them over the line. And that's why I get annoyed with One Nation, who sort of don't want to work with other minor parties, because they're only in the Senate thanks to the preferences of the other minor parties. So they need to start showing more respect to the other minor parties and start working with us, because they owe it to the Australian people. And Pauline and Malcolm made a lot of money out of the Australian taxpayer, and Pauline hasn't gone to estimates in the 6 years I was there, and hardly turned up. Well, probably turned up at the chamber 50% of the time, if that. So I think that, if you genuinely care about the best interest of Australia, One Nation need to think about working with the other minor parties as well, and express their gratitude for our preferences in getting their senators up.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back to one more critique of One Nation that a lot of people have, will be how are you going to delegate power to the branches within your party? will they have full autonomy to select candidates? I know that's something that even the Liberal Party doesn't have. Or is there still going to be executive control from yourself, for example?
Well, all candidates still have to be vetted, so they all still have to provide police checks. So obviously, I still can override if bad decisions are made. So if we find out that someone was convicted rapist or someone had a domestic violence charge or something like that, or was involved in some sort of criminal activity or something unbecoming, then there's the state executive still has the power to pull that particular candidate. So that's just being practical, right? I mean, we've got to, you still got
Absolutely.
to have checks and balances in place. But the point is, the candidates will be selected firstly by the branches, and provided that everything's transparent, then that's who they'll be. Like, it's not going to be, obviously, I may put forward people or recommend or endorse people that I know, because I think they'll have the better chance of winning. And that happens all the time in other parties, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, ultimately, it's up to the branch members to have their say in who they want.
Yep. Okay. Well, that's and I suppose you are staking your reputation on the fact that you have been thrust out of the Liberal Party on pretty, I'd say, dodgy grounds at the very least. You've contested obviously the way that you were kicked off of the position on the Senate ballot. And so, if you were to then go about and sort of do similar things, similar shenanigans to the Liberal Party, obviously your reputation's at stake. So the branch
Yeah, that's
membership
right.
would hold you to account. And no, what you're saying about having some checks and balances is obviously essential. I don't think anyone would argue against that. So it is relieving to hear that you are going to be giving more power to your membership than One Nation does.
Yeah,
Matthew, did you
absolutely.
have any questions to jump in?
I just was asking about how you could be more free to approach this previous election as your own party versus being as part of as part of the Liberal Party. Were you able to do new things in campaigning and reaching voters, and what did you learn from that situation of being free?
Oh, look, we just had much more policy autonomy, and that was the part in the end when I decided to quit the party. Obviously, I'd lost. It's pretty demotivating when your own party state council vote to allow the executive to override its own constitution. But the other thing was I wanted the opportunity to talk about policy for 8 months, which I could never do under the Liberal Party. We were pretty much gagged. So it was good, like, bringing it, for example, the policy of the lifting the tax rate. The policy we just discussed, an infrastructure bank where we fund the construction of our infrastructure, just like companies fund the construction of their own coal mines through issuing shares. We should have a federal infrastructure bank that issues shares in our own dams and power stations. We don't need to borrow foreign debt for that. As you know, anything about a balance sheet, you have debt and equity on a balance sheet. Why we use foreign debt when we should be using domestic equity to fund our own, untap our own wealth effectively, is just madness. So we've got that policy. We've still got the policy of eliminating the duplication of roles and responsibilities of state governments. We want a judicial commission, independent judicial commission. We want to bring back cross-media ownership so that the big media break up big media in this country. I mean, that was Teddy Roosevelt 100 years ago, a bit over 100 years ago, did the same thing in the States when he broke up the power of the big companies. We need to be doing that here. One I really like is that farmers can form cooperatives again. Just beggars belief that farmers can't form co-ops where the turnover is greater than $10 million. We're really proud of that one. We can lift the GST threshold to $250,000. That has been lifted since 2000. It's that's the bit that I really enjoyed, is the fact that we can just get on and push policy. And as I said, I think we've got the best policies across all the parties. And not that they'd ever take me up on it, but I would love to debate some of the ministers and shadow ministers in the major parties, because it wouldn't be difficult to outpoint them on policies.
Yeah, yeah. Well, your range of policies and the depth with which you've thought about them is really the remarkable part about the campaign that you ran. You sort of did a unprecedented, you attempted an unprecedented method of campaigning in the recent election, very different from the major parties and even a lot of the minor parties, which was you sort of appeared on a lot of independent media, particularly podcasts, not unlike this. And I apologize for pulling you out of retirement after the election to come on another podcast. I'm sure you're sick of it. But I was
I'm not
checking out
sick of
some
it.
of your
I'm
previous
just, yeah,
appearances.
it's just
Yeah,
very
you're
like,
probably
yeah,
telling.
just
I
busy
can
with
imagine
setting up
you probably want
branches.
to.
Yeah,
But I was checking out some of your previous appearances, and each podcast I listened to, which had different sort of fields that they covered. For example, I checked out the Unemployable podcast, and I checked out another one which was name slips my mind right now, and then the NatCon podcast. And in each one, you talked about the range of policies you had, sort of that is interesting to each of those groups. With the Unemployable one, you were talking about your business policies, and just listening to that, the depth with which you explained it was, I think, shocking even the presenters on the show. And it makes you wonder, why aren't we already doing all these things that you're suggesting? And I suppose it all comes down to mismanagement, or even in some cases malicious management from our government, from our bureaucracy for so long. You keep drawing back to the 80s, of course, talking about Keating and how he relaxed the controls. He
capital
floated the
controls.
dollar. Yes, of course, and then so on. You talk about foreign policy and so on. I think a policy which is particularly interesting to young people, and that would include Matthew and myself. I'd say we're still fairly young, is immigration and your stance on immigration restriction. Of course, we are at the age where we're starting to try to get into the property market. We'd like to start families eventually, and we need a place to live in. And yet, we find that we're competing with all of the numbers of the world in order to buy a home just to live in, not even for an investment like previous generations were afforded the privilege of doing. We're looking to just get into them to live, and we're finding that we're running up against foreign buyers, and also the huge glut of migrants that we've seen come into our country recently. Would you like to talk a little bit on why immigration in particular was a issue you raised throughout the election, and why you think it's important to tackle it and bring those numbers down?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to be clear, People First is pro-immigration, and we believe Australia is a country built on immigration. But we're immigration to 100,000 people a year, and those 100,000 people in the main need to be coming here, adding value, just like our forefathers added value when they came here. So you can talk
Mm.
recently after World War II, and the Italians who went to North Queensland and built the sugarcane farms. They're the type of immigrants we want. Now, we believe the immigration is too high, running at 450,000 or 500,000, depending on how you count it, because obviously it does create a housing issue, and it's being used to prop up how. And I've discussed this before in other podcasts, but effectively it's a symptom of the poor capital controls that were introduced in the 1980s, that saw house prices go through the roof. And I'll say through the roof, went from 3 to 4 times earnings in the 80s up to 12 to 13 times earnings today. That forced two parents back to work to be able to afford a mortgage. 2008, there was a GFC. That meant many people were going to have to sell their houses to pay off their home loans and end up back on the pension with no house. So the government allowed foreign students to enter the country, and then they were then allowed to purchase houses. So it's important to understand. A lot of people think immigration's the problem. I think it's actually a symptom of the poor economic management in the decades leading up to this latest explosion. And that includes both lifting capital controls and walking away from our manufacturing sector. So, which then saw a decline in our skills sector, which meant that our workforce is is not diversified enough. Hence why and ended up, we were told in the 80s that if we freed markets, lift the capital controls, free markets, and let our manufacturing go offshore, we'd become a high service economy or a service economy. Well, we didn't become a high service economy. We became a low service economy in things like NDIS, childcare, superannuation, paper shuffling. So we need to remix our workforce and get more people back on the tools. We need to start doing things for ourselves. By all means, let's keep immigration at 100,000, but they need to be selectively chosen based on their skill set and their ability to obviously mingle in Australia. One thing we won't start doing is immigrant bashing, because if you want to lose an argument when it comes to immigration, start immigrant bashing. It's not an argument you're going to win, because more than 50% of the people in this country now were either born overseas or have a parent that was born overseas. So let's just acknowledge that we were all immigrants, in the last 250 years. but we have to also acknowledge that the immigration rate's way too high, and that we need people, and as a third part to this, of course, is that we also have a lot of immigration. Is some people perceive a Muslim problem. I would argue, well, and certain parties seem to want to engage in the Muslim bashing, but then seem to ignore the regime change wars in the last 20 years in the Middle East. So I would suggest that, tied up with immigration is also calling out the PSYOPs by the intelligence agencies called the War on Terror that has led to these Middle Eastern regime changes that has then led to a flood of immigrants coming from Middle Eastern countries. So I'm not going to, I have a real problem with sort of Muslim bashing about the immigration here when, we've been dropping bombs on these, I say the West, well, we, the West, have been dropping bombs on the Middle East. So we need to get out of the Middle East and leave the Middle East to themselves. And we just need to reduce our immigration intake to a more sustainable level so that Australians can get houses. By all means, bring in some immigration where the work's needed, and but at this stage, we probably and we want people first policies reduce immigrants to 100,000 a year, which will probably end up in a slight negative immigration rate as students finish their degrees, other foreign students finish degrees and go back home. But ultimately, we need to. I mean, just stopping immigration in itself won't solve the problem of not building enough houses and not rebuilding our manufacturing sector. To do that, we also have to actually reskill our workforce and stop subsidising these rent-seeking industries that are actually, in my view, resulting in many, societal issues, the family breakdowns, violence on the streets and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a very reasonable policy to put forward because the vast majority of Australians do agree with the reduction in immigration you see throughout polling. And what makes your policy better than most other parties is this focus on the benefit to Australia. A lot of other parties, they say, they talk about the shortage of workers, critical skill shortages, pardon me. But
Yeah.
you've really talked about the need to reskill domestic people here to fill those gaps before we have to look overseas.
Yeah.
And I want to bring a second criticism of our immigration system as it currently is from a lot of people online, is that we've seen a rise in a lot of antisocial behaviours in parts of our major cities. So particularly knife crimes in Victoria, where they've recently had to ban machetes, but also throughout Sydney and Brisbane, this has been a case. And there seems to be a political consensus that once these people are in our country and they commit crimes, that we can't send them back. We have to keep them here, and these people often repeat offenders. Is there any policy or potential for a policy within your party to address these antisocial or these immigrants that can't
We have
assimilate?
policies where if immigrants commit violent crimes, they're deported. But yet again, focusing on the minority of people that commit these crimes isn't going to win us an election. And you can check out our policy. We've got very strict policies on that, but we're not going to focus on the small number of people that commit crimes because I just don't see the point in that. Like we've got the policy. You can see our immigration policy on our website, but focusing on, I mean, what have we got? 500,000 immigrants a year. I mean, half the country's, I think 33% of people, 31. We're the world's practically the world's highest number of people, percentage of people that aren't born here. But that's about 8 million people. So yes, we have a small number of people that commit crimes. That's an issue where they can be deported. But we really need to be focusing on the bigger picture, which is why have we allowed this immigration rate to be so high in the first place? And we need to solve the problem or solve that problem of how it was allowed to happen. And that was going back to, if you've heard my spiel on the 80s, lifting capital controls in 85, John Button turning his back on the manufacturing industry, Dawkins starting the education sector, Keating, making it harder for young people to save for a home by forcing compulsory superannuation, And so those four policies, along with the Franklin Dam decision, which has just meant the federal government overrides the state government and has added a second layer of regulation to just about every item, on business, is what's killing this country. And they're the issues we need to focus on, so that we can be able to reduce immigration without bringing down things like hospitality industries, the farming industries that rely heavily on immigration, and other areas. But I'm just thinking probably the mining industry relies on immigration as well. So that we can use Australian labour to replace that, and not have to rely on foreign labour to do the jobs that Australians won't do.
Yeah, I largely agree with you, and of course, Matthew as well. But I think what you were saying earlier is important to emphasize. It's not really the individuals in a lot of cases that we're bashing. It does need to be focused on the government because, of course, people want to come live here. We're an amazing country. We've got abundance, a lot of opportunities. I cannot knock anyone that wants to come here, live a productive life, raise their children in a safe environment where there are plenty of jobs and lots of opportunity. Nonetheless, I do think that there are some criticisms to be made of multiculturalism and how far it's gone. I do think we need a little bit more focus on the compatibility of migrants, the quality of migrants, which is something you've addressed in terms of their contribution to the economy, of course. And you do keep mentioning Keating. A big part of Keating's motivation for why he wanted to see the economy changed in such a radical way, and his opposition to people like John Stone, for example, was that he really had an animus for the quote unquote old Australia that he described that had very Anglophilic tendencies. You know, it obviously came from the founding stock of Britain. And he was in favour of really furthering the Whitlam Revolution, which was to completely change Australia from being a British, or you could say maybe Anglo-Celtic society, into a firmly multicultural society that has no fixed identity, that can't really say we're from here, this is our heritage, this is where our forefathers came from, this is our identity. And I think he was largely successful. I mean, we've seen the globalization of the population. At the same time, we've seen the globalization of the economy, and we've seen all the resultant effects, many positive, but many very negative as well. And I won't put you on the spot with that. I mean, you can respond in any way that you
Well, I
want,
mean, I can
Gerard.
respond to it. I mean, most immigrants that come here don't come here with a view, like they're happy to adapt to the Australian
Oh, of
way of
course,
life. Now, if you
undoubtedly.
have an immigrant rate of 500,000 a year, like it will be, you will dilute the Australian culture, and the immigrants will tend to stay in their communities where they have come from. Now, I don't have a problem with immigrants doing that when it's a small number of immigrants, but obviously, if you're doing it at a very high rate, you do run the risk of balkanising, the country, and we don't want to see that happen. But I don't think most immigrants that come here, regardless if they come here with the intention to balkanise the country. And I don't think going on about it and trying to alienate those immigrants are helping either, because I believe in the main most immigrants do want to assimilate, and a lot of immigrants, they're hardworking people. This is one thing where I'm not going to. Yeah, I see a lot of this on X where it's just immigrant bashing all the time. It's toxic and it's feral, and the right has become like the left. The right on X today has become like the left was on Twitter 6 years ago, and it is turning people off. It is not the way to win an argument. As I said, we need to reduce the immigrant rate. I've got no qualms about that. But we need to also, and it's a value I hold very dear, is respect the dignity and worth of every individual. And I will call it, by all means, we will call it as we see it. Where we see illegal and criminal behaviour, let's call it out, but let's just call it out for illegal and immigrant behaviour, because casting aspersions, it's only going to create more tension and won't actually help solve the problem. This is why, in my view, One Nation has got nowhere in 20 years. Pauline is not, Pauline Hanson came, into politics complaining about the immigration rate and how, immigrants are going to change the face of Australia. Look, they said that about the Italians after World War II, and the Greeks. I'd argue the Italians and Greeks have added, a lot of culture to Australia. Look, the Vietnamese, Dai Li, like she's more rocker. I caught an elevator with Di once, and she probably dropped the F bomb more times. I remember getting out of the lift and thinking, "My God, she's more rocker than some of my mates." So, I just don't. I'm not going down this whole people will integrate if you let them integrate. Let's just, judge each individual as they are. And look, I was in my 30s. I spent almost 7 years overseas from 23 to 30. Sorry, in my 20s, from 23 to traveling the world, and this is something I can tell you that most people just want a roof over their head and want the best thing for their children. We share that common interest of a better life for our children, and we need to really focus on, working together and putting the people first, regardless of their background or race, and standing up to the real enemy, which is the unrestrained authority of the institutions and the yes men and the toadies that climb to the top of these institutions. Because I can assure you, if there's one common thread that binds us all apart from the fact we want a better life for our children, is that we all hate our governments and our politicians and the blowhards that reside within those walls.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some things we could quibble on here, and I do think we have a difference of opinion, but it's not going to do us any good to really drill into it because, I mean, you've stated what you believe. I'm not going to change that, and I do
Yeah.
largely agree with you, but I maybe take a little bit of a harder stance on cultural issues. Nonetheless, I did notice you mentioned something in there which I think we do have strong agreement on, which is the sort of the selling out of our government to a lot of foreign interests, the intrusion of, for example, the intel agencies into our lives and things like that. I know that was a focus, particularly after the election on X. You made a lot of mention of, for example, the false flag attacks that have been taking place in Australia, potentially to push certain narratives. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I'll talk about the intelligence agencies in general. I mean, it's been my view for a long time they're the true puppet masters in conjunction with the central banks. I mean, when Keating lifted capital controls and floated the dollar, the reality is when he floated the dollar and the idea that the dollar was just going to sit out there and be traded freely on a market. Nothing further from the truth. Ultimately, every currency needs to be controlled because a currency is a medium of exchange. You cannot have volatility of 4 or 5% overnight volatility in price volatility on your currency of 4 or 5%. I know that as a treasury accountant for two ASX listed companies because you just couldn't do international business, if you had that much volatility. And that's why I call out Bitcoin as a currency, because it's just way too volatile, notwithstanding it'll probably go to $1 million the way it's been structured. But the intelligence agencies, and so central banks, someone needs to control the currency, but I believe it should be our government, not unelected central banks, just for that, putting that issue there. But I've always felt there's been too much focus on the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. They do push, albeit they do push soft issues, but yet again, you can't resolve those issues until you get better people in Parliament, and that won't happen until you get a party with branches and who elect politicians who have the courage to say what they think. But yeah, no. Look. The intelligence agencies that planted the lies about the chemical weapons in Iraq. It was a chemical CIA that overthrew the democratically elected leader in Iran in '53. If you go back through time, you'll see it's the CIA in particular. That drives a lot of these things, and Mossad, dare I say it. I mean, I'll upset a lot of people because I mentioned Mossad, but if you've actually followed me for the last 5 or 6 years, I criticise the CIA and ASIO just as much, but for some reason, if I criticise Mossad, I'm anti-Semitic, which is just rubbish, because Mossad is the second biggest espionage agency in the world, which is saying something for a country the size of Israel, which is about 8 to 10 million people, I think. But I've been critical. I'm also critical of the emphasis on the World Economic Forum as being the harbinger of the sort of globalism. And to me, it's been the CIA. They're maybe not pushing the globalism, but they're certainly pushing centralised control of the world's wealth, and making sure that the banks, via the petrodollar, it's called the US dollar, but it's really the deep state dollar, because obviously the dollar needs to be backed by physical commodities. And it's the role of the intelligence agencies to make sure that they control the Middle East, because the world's biggest physical commodity, of course, is oil. And now Russia is the world's biggest energy producer. But obviously, Russia's a bit too big of a fish to a bone to chew. So the next biggest part of the world that controls energy, of course, is the Middle East. and the intelligence agency have to control the Middle East because they have to control the world's biggest physical commodity, because that's what backs the world's biggest commodity of all, which is US dollar bond market. And there's nothing new in that. Look, this is before World War One. It was the British pound. I mean, that's why after World War One, after the Federal Reserve was set up in 1913, World War One broke out because they had to transfer the wealth of the world from originally Germany, and then World War Two, it was Britain who repaid their debts to the US, and that was how the wealth was transferred from the old world to the new world. To make sure that and the new world, of course, was controlled by the US. They were now the strongest power in the world, and that's basically what happened. That was the reason for World War One and World War Two, behind the scenes at least. So look, and of course we know with COVID, the CIA knew that was a gain of function. There was gain of function research. It was BARDA that encouraged the gain of function research in Wuhan. They've tried to deny it, made out that it was natural selection. But the CIA was behind all that. My view was, I say the CIA, intelligence agencies knew about that. I strongly suspect ASIO were in on that as well, because of the existence of a bloke called Edward Holmes, who's is he biochemistry is the right word? He's certainly he's biology professor at University of Sydney, and I strongly suspect he was an intelligence agency agent who was infiltrated the Chinese biolabs. So he was a part of the cover-up, because Anthony Fauci, Edward Holmes, a British scientist who emigrated to Australia, working for the University of Sydney. Ed Holmes was one of the first people Fauci called after COVID broke out. And I've always thought to myself, why would Fauci call the bloke on the other side of the world just one research scientist? So my view, and then in the papers released by Jeremy someone far, was it? He said, Holmes is quoted as saying he'll contact the intelligence agencies or the intelligence. And I was like, how would he know who the intelligence agencies are? How would he have their number? So, look, do I think the intelligence agencies play a large part in dictating, the direction of Western governments? Absolutely, as they do in other governments as well, not just Western governments. Because ultimately behind the scenes is what they call the great game, and it's all about trying to control the world's resources. And to a certain point, there's that is a valid function. But you don't release viruses, you don't go dropping chemical bombs on countries that don't have chemical weapons, you don't engage in regime change. You can do things, that encourage countries just through diplomacy to try and win them over, rather than destroy people's lives, and that's my issue. Notwithstanding, intelligence
as well.
agencies. Yeah. I mean, intelligence agencies do have a role to play in terms of protecting a country's interests, but it shouldn't be at the expense of destroying other countries. And it shouldn't be,
Well,
it
yeah.
should be protecting countries' interests, not billionaires' interests, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you're putting a lot of emphasis on the commodities sort of aspect, but also there is the political control. We look at, for example, how much leeway we give to our allies or our supposed allies, such as America and their intel agencies involved in our country. I mean, Pine Gap is an example. Or, for example, Israel and Mossad. And we know that Mossad has extensively penetrated our government and also our own sort of media circle as well, as we saw in the recent election. And these things are sort of excused when we, of course, crack down on China for much lesser offences. I'm not saying we should go easy on China, but I do think we should be going a lot tougher on our supposed allies and forcing them to basically respect our sovereignty. They need to respect that we are our own country. We want to decide our own destiny, and we don't appreciate the kind of false flag attacks or the threatening of our politicians. I think back to Mossad with Kevin Rudd threatening to replace him with Gillard if he didn't back down on the passport scandal to do with a Mossad assassination. So,
Yeah. I mean, look,
there's various.
I mean, look, I've got a bit more leniency with the United States because they did help save us in World War Two. And I like to distinguish between the United States and the deep state. So the country of the United States, made up of the people, and especially what their forefathers did in 1776 and overturning the British establishment and kicking them out of the colonies. I completely agree with it. I think most Americans, are good people who don't trust their government. As I've said when I travel the world, they don't trust their government any more than we do. But unfortunately, because the USA is the strongest military country in the world, it's been infiltrated by the deep state in order to use the US military to protect its interests. So the US military is used as we were to a much lesser degree, are used as mercenaries to protect the interests of the wealthy, deep state actors, including banks and billionaires, etc., etc.
Well, and we saw
So,
how Trump was dragged into the war, into bombing Iran on behalf of Israel as well recently.
absolutely. So,
And we
yeah,
almost got tangled up in that. Imagine a Dutton government when that whole altercation went on, how quickly we would have been the lapdogs of the US had
yeah,
things escalated,
yeah.
which
Well, I
thankfully
prefer to
they
say the
didn't.
lapdogs of the deep state because I'm not sure that a lot of
Sure.
Americans want Israel pulling their politician strings either.
Oh, no, absolutely not.
But that's
No.
my problem with Israel. Israel expects everyone to go in there and save them, and ultimately, when Netanyahu sent those missiles into Iran, that there's been weapon inspectors in Iran for decades. Iran, I do think, look, to be fair, does play a bit of brinkmanship there, rightly or wrongly, and I probably think there's a little bit of wrong, there's wrongly going on there as well. But you don't solve the problem by lobbing missiles in there, knowing that could conflate into World War III. I never criticised Trump in any of that because I thought he actually did quite well in extracting, he went and dropped the bombs on whatever the nuclear facilities were. There's obviously question marks over how effective that was, but it seemed to sort of put Israel back in its back box and shut them down. But look, I don't mind working with the United States. Australia needs allies, and note my words, United States, not deep state, right? So, the good
Yep,
side
yep.
of the United States who believe in democracy and representation and freedom and all that, and most Americans do. I think, the Western governments still, notwithstanding their decline in accountability and transparency over the last 20 years, and the poor management and the government overreach into people's lives. The ideal of a democracy, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's better than any other system. Notwithstanding, it still has a lot of flaws. But a lot of those flaws aren't really democracy's fault. They're the fault of the weak and gutless politicians or bureaucrats who don't, who lack integrity. But yeah, what Israel did then, and I don't like how Israel are trying to drag other countries into problems. They need to start relying on diplomacy because you're not going to sort out the crisis in the Middle East by just lobbing missiles into your neighbours, regardless of whether or not you like them. You've got to use diplomacy. If you expect to sort of be able to have a enduring, peaceful relationship in the region you're in. So that was my problem there, and I think Trump did a good job. I think he's done a shocking job with the Epstein stuff, but up with that Iran stuff, he's sort of diffusing it, pretending it'll look, from what I can gather, well, I don't know what happened there in Qatar and Iran, but long story short, they seem to avert a bigger catastrophe in the Middle East for the time being until, it's hard not to think there'll be another false flag somewhere, with a view of sort of trying to stoke up another conflict somewhere. But anyway, and so I think we do need to be putting the spotlight much more onto the intelligence agencies. They were very lucky and got away with a lot as a result of the Iraq War. I don't think there's ever been an official policy by any Western government for what happened in Iraq. Yet again with Syria, they were fighting Al Qaeda for decades, and now they've backflipped, and they're in bed with Al Qaeda in Syria. And the bloke who was a notorious, what's his name, Jelani, and at the same time, they've lifted the sanctions on him, and they've gone and put sanctions on the UN rapporteur or whatever she's called to Gaza because she's been slagging off what's been going on in Gaza, they put sanctions on her. Well, this particular Albanese, Francesca Albanese is her name. I'm not certainly Albanese, but she's not dropping bombs or a terrorist. I mean, you mightn't agree with what she says, but it's a bit rough to be putting sanctions on her and not and then lifting sanctions on Jelani. I mean, the whole double standards, and this is what I hate. Notwithstanding, I still think that we do have better human rights in the West, even though they're rapidly eroding than other countries. It should also be said the double standards around how, for example, Iran's considered a terrible regime, and they do have a shocking human rights record, I should add there. But then there's a blind eye turned to the shocking human rights record in Saudi Arabia, all because Saudi Arabia is on our side. So let's not criticise Saudi Arabia's human rights. So, or let's now accept Al Qaeda as the government in Syria. Well, I'm sorry, but Assad is nowhere near as bad as what Al Qaeda's been. But you wouldn't know it by the way they paint him out to be. So it's just the double standards in the Middle East. How basically, if you're on our side, well, you can break whatever human rights you like, and that's okay. But if you're not on our side, we're going to demonise you. And look, I'm not saying any players in the Middle East are saints. They're not. But it's just the double standards and the interference, and then the West has committed some atrocious atrocities there, Vietnam, other places. So I don't think we should be getting on our soapbox, criticising some of these other regimes to the extent that we do, whilst ignoring our own, human rights abuses, albeit admittedly more likely, in other countries than here. But there's still a lot of government overreach going on here as well.
Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of the episode. There was a lot to digest in there, and I thank you for coming on, Gerard. And I particularly commend your extremely courageous stand that you took on the issues that you were just discussing around Israel, around these certain governments. Many times, a lot of your colleagues will cover up for them. I mean, you've got Hanson; she's quite a fan of Israel, and of course, family first. I don't want to cause problems, but a lot of your colleagues turn a blind eye to a lot of these problems when, of course, you run in the other direction towards the fire and you try to help out in any way that you can.
Yeah,
So it's something that it really impresses me, and that's what that's why I think people first has such a bright future, because of the fact that you're not controlled by anyone and that you've demonstrated that.
yeah, and it's important to add too, just on Israel. We need to be clear here. There's Jewish people, there's Israeli people, and then there's people who have an ideology, called Zionism, and that can be Christians and Jews. My view, though, is if you're born in Israel since 1948, you're an Israeli, right? So just like we're Australians born here, and there's plenty of Israelis who disagree with Netanyahu. Actually, one of the reasons why Netanyahu has continuing these wars and is constantly a bit like Zelensky in Ukraine is because if he has to go to an election, he's probably going to lose. So there's plenty of Israelis who disagree with what Netanyahu's doing. And it all went downhill in Israel. Well, it's always been a rough ship there, but it certainly went backwards after Rabin was shot. And I can seem to recall even back in '95, people were pointing the finger at Netanyahu for assassinating Rabin, who was shot by a right wing extreme, Israeli back then. So we need to be careful too that not all Israelis are bad. Not all Palestinians are bad, not all, all these Iranians are bad, whatever. We need to call it as we see it. But the Netanyahu government and what they're doing in Gaza is completely just intolerable. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we're in full agreement with you on. But we've held you for long enough. I know that you had other things that you needed to do, so we won't steal any more of your time. Thank you for coming on, Gerard. Is there
You're
any
welcome,
social
John.
media sources you'd like to direct people to?
Look, at the moment, I'm currently suspended on Facebook. I'm not suspended, but I just haven't been posting because I can't get the word senator out of my Facebook page. So we're working on that. But yeah, obviously, look, I hope to start posting again on Facebook soon. I've had a little bit of time off social media after 6 years. I needed it. And I want to focus on setting up branches as well. But yeah, obviously, we're on Facebook, TikTok, X, Instagram, and YouTube. So feel free to go back and have a look at some of my old posts. And there'll be, when we do get back up and running in our own podcast, we'll have plenty to talk about.
Brilliant. I'll put all those links down in the description of the episode so people can go have a look. And I'd recommend anyone that liked what you heard from Gerard to go join up with People First. It does seem like the future, so it's a project I'd really like to direct people towards.
Yeah,
and
thanks, John. Appreciate
Matthew,
that.
did you have anything to? Yeah, no worries. Thank you for coming on.
As always, like and subscribe. And if you want to go into a bit more of the data behind Gerard's recent election results in the state of Queensland, go to nationalobserver.co. Our data guy, Flynn, did an excellent piece on that. And have a good week, everyone. Thank you, Gerard.
That's thenationalobserver.co. But yes, thank you. See you later, Gerard.
Okay, thanks, guys. Have a great night.